And the day I got out of college, in June of 1948, I knew one thing, and that is I had to go to work. And I had to get a job. And I was offered a job in Odessa, Texas.
He was a Texan by choice, an oilman by trade, but it was politics and a presidency that earned George Herbert Walker Bush a place in history. He was born in New England in 1924, the son of Senator Prescott Bush and Dorothy Walker Bush. He attended boarding school at the prestigious Phillips Academy, but on his graduation, life and the world changed. Pearl Harbor introduced George Bush to the Navy. He joined at age 18 to become the youngest Navy aviator of his day. Assigned to the USS San Jacinto, he fought in the Pacific Theater. In 1944, Bush was piloting a plane that was hit by Japanese anti-aircraft fire. With his plane on fire, he completed his bombing run, the sole survivor of his three-man crew. His Navy record includes 58 combat missions and the Distinguished Flying Cross.
And I often count my blessings as to why my life was spared. One of my crewmen got out of the plane. His chute did not open. Another one was killed in the plane. And you go, why me? But more importantly, it taught me how great it was to be able to serve my country.
When George Bush returned home, he married his sweetheart, Barbara Pierce. A family quickly followed, including firstborn George W. Bush. And like so many GIs, the new father went to college. Yale, a family tradition, where he was also a member of the secret society called Skull and Bones. He graduated from Yale in 2.5 years. With a growing family, he needed a job, and his father's connections drew him to the oil business and dresser industries. He began as a sales clerk, moved the family to Midland, later founding Zapata Petroleum. In '58, the family moved to Houston, where prosperity allowed Mr. Bush to cultivate his other ambition, politics.
I think that we need to take a whole look at the setup in Washington.
It started off small as chairman of the Harris County Republican Party, but he aimed high, running for U.S. Senate, winning the primary but facing a Texas institution, Democrat Ralph Yarborough. Bush lost. In '66, he was elected to Congress from Houston's 7th Congressional District and was reelected. But then President Richard Nixon convinced Bush to run for Senate again, and again he lost in 1970 against Democrat Lloyd Bentsen. Nixon repaid Mr. Bush with an appointment as UN ambassador. During Watergate, he was Republican National Committee chairman. Eventually, he would call on Richard Nixon to resign.
They felt they had to, at some point, say enough is enough.
Mr. Bush continued his public service career as envoy to Communist China.
I like taking the American message to places where it's not particularly well understood, and I expect maybe China is as good an example of that kind of a country as any.
CIA director, and in 1980 he took on Ronald Reagan for the party's presidential nomination and lost, only to become Reagan's vice president and 8 years later, the 41st president of the United States.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
It was a time of change. The Berlin Wall was torn down and dictators tumbled.
Elements of the 82nd Airborne left Fort Bragg. Our jump went very well.
In Panama, the Noriega regime fell following a U.S. invasion ordered by the president.
He is up against an immovable force. He is up against something that is not going to yield.
And in 1990, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, Mr. Bush ordered Operation Desert Storm.
Our strategy to go after this army is very, very simple. First, we're going to cut it off, and then we're going to kill it.
It was the first war to be carried on live television, beginning with airstrikes, ending with ground forces. But the Allied invasion stopped short. Saddam Hussein left in power, a decision debated still. Buoyed by a coalition victory, President Bush entered into the re-election campaign with a high approval rating, but there was another storm cloud on the horizon, a recession.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
Those words came back to haunt him as a broken promise, and rising unemployment was seized by the Democratic candidate Bill Clinton.
He said my economic plan reminded him of Elvis economics. The difference in Elvis economics and Bush economics plan is that Elvis has been cited in a number of places lately.
Months after being nominated at the Republican National Convention in Houston, George Herbert Walker Bush left the White House as a one-term president.
So I had my chance, and we got some things right. I'm sure we screwed some things up. And it's better to let future historians, not present historians, talk about the record. I hate the legacy word, but that kind of thing.
But on the horizon, two sons, one governor of Texas, the other of Florida, both with higher ambitions. It would be George W. Bush, who 8 years later became the 43rd president, barely. His election decided after a Supreme Court decision to stop a recount in Florida.
And as a father, as a grandfather, as one who loves his family first more than anything, politics, business, anything else, what better reward could I have?
Bush 41 appeared not to actively advise his son on policy. Instead, he took to parachuting, starting on his 75th birthday.
I got your back here.
Then joining up with his former opponent, Bill Clinton, to raise money for the victims of the tsunami and Hurricanes Katrina and Rita.
So what's easier is the fact that we put the politics aside and we're here hoping to help the victims of this horrible Katrina.
You want how old he is?
Are you, old friend?
He remained visible, celebrating the anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall.
And the wall could confine them from loved ones and lock them in a failing economic system, but in the end, it could not extinguish the embers of their undying hope or harness their human desire for freedom.
Spending time at his presidential library at Texas A&M and here at home. Going to Texans and Astros games. Cheering on runners in the Houston Marathon. And always with wife Barbara, who had emergency heart surgery in 2009, Mr. Bush emotionally reflecting on what was most important in life.
We heard from 4 presidents of the United States: Obama, Clinton, Jimmy Carter, and George Bush. George W. Bush, and me, 5. And I think there's a lot of interest because of who she is.
George Herbert Walker Bush was the last American president to fight in a war, the last of what's called the greatest generation. And other than John and John Quincy Adams, the last father and son pair of presidents. That is the history he leaves. But the impact of his life he once wished was this.
But I hope what they say, look, he did his best and he did it with honor, served with honor and integrity.